$7 million, 3 years. 11 specialists brought in from 6 states, including 2 from firms that charged more per day than most people earned in a year. And still the 1969 Dodge Charger sat in the climate-controlled garage of Camille Ashford's Blue Ridge estate, like something preserved and grieving at the same time, its hemi-orange paint so vivid under the overhead lights that it seemed almost aggressive. A car full of fury with nowhere to go. Camille could buy anything. She had bought a lot of things in her 53 years, and she had built or negotiated most of the things that couldn't be bought outright. She had taken a failing pharmaceutical logistics company at 29 and turned it into a $4 billion enterprise by the time she was 40. She had testified before Congress and sat across from men who made it their business to be intimidating, and she had not flinched from any of it. She could not fix this. The Charger had belonged to her father, Roy Ashford. Roy had been a machinist for 41 years at a components plant in Akron, Ohio. Union hourly, the kind of man who knew every coworker's wife's name and their kids' school schedules, and kept a thermos of black coffee at his station and wore the same style of steel-toed boot his entire working life. He had large, square hands with calluses so deep they had become part of him, the way tree bark becomes part of a tree. He smelled like machine oil and, on Sundays, like the Old Spice he applied with the same serious attention he gave everything else. He had saved for the Charger for 37 years. Camille found this out from a ledger after he died, an actual handwritten ledger, columns and balances in his precise, blocky print, going back to 1983. He had been putting away between $40 and $60 a month, every month, into a savings account he called the Project, a name she found written on the account tab in the same careful hand. He bought the car at 63, called her the night he signed the papers, and she could hear something in his voice she had never quite heard from him before. A looseness, a lightness, like a man who had just set down something he had been carrying. So long he had stopped noticing its weight. "Dad," she had said, "you sound like a teenager." He laughed, and it was the best laugh she had heard from him in years. He drove the Charger 4 times. Twice around the block the first weekend, once to a car show in Canton, and once on a Sunday afternoon in October when the maples were turning. After that, he kept it in the garage under a canvas cover, and he checked on it the way you check on something you love too much to be casual with. Every Sunday morning, he would lift the edge of the cover and look at it, run his palm along the quarter panel, and replace the cover with something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite worry but lived between the two. He died 16 months later. Heart attack, mid-morning on a Wednesday, alone in the house. A neighbor found him. Camille flew back to Akron and spent 4 days doing what grief requires. Arrangements, calls, the mechanical movement through rooms that still smelled like him. On the last morning, she went into the garage and stood beside the covered car for a long time. Then she had it transported to her property in the mountains of western North Carolina. The first repair team arrived 6 weeks later. 4 technicians, 1 lead engineer, all certified, all confident. The engine was mechanically sound, compression excellent, valve train in remarkable shape for a car that had been stored and rarely driven. The issue was electrical. The car would not start, would not crank, and every diagnostic reading came back clean, which was the problem. Clean readings on a car that refused to start meant the fault was somewhere the tools weren't reaching. They left after 5 days. Then came the next team and the next. By year 2, Camille had spent $4 million and heard 11 variations of the same conclusion. The fault existed, everyone could see its effects, and nobody could find its origin. By year 3, the number was 7 million, and the conclusion had not changed. The 11th team was led by a diagnostic specialist named Dr. Werner, who had published a graduate paper on mid-century American ignition systems and who had been, according to the contact who recommended him, the best there was at this particular problem. He was thorough. He stayed 8 days. On the morning of the 9th, Camille found him standing outside the garage instead of in it, and she knew before he spoke. He was sorry. The fault was in the integration between 2 systems, he said. The diagnostic behavior was consistent, which meant the cause was somewhere fixed and permanent. But whatever it was existed outside the parameters his instruments were calibrated to find. Attempting to repair something he could not locate carried a real risk of additional damage. He could not recommend it. Camille thanked him in the voice she kept for exactly this situation. Professional, flat, giving nothing away. She waited until his van reached the end of the driveway. Then she went into the garage and pressed her forehead against the driver's window and stayed there for several minutes. She had made a silent promise in her father's garage in Akron the morning before the transport truck came. She had looked at the covered shape of the car and told herself she would fix it. She would get it running. She would hear what Roy Ashford had heard those 4 times he drove it, and she would drive it the way he never quite let himself drive it, all the way open, the way it was built to be driven. $7 million and 11 teams later, she was not sure she believed that anymore. Pearl, who had kept the estate running for 11 years with the focused competence of someone who treated every problem as solvable, brought up the name Callahan 3 days after Werner left. She said it the way she said things she expected resistance to, carefully, without inflection. There's a garage in Millhaven, about 8 miles down the valley. Man named Callahan. He fixed the electrical issue in the East Cottage 2 years ago. The building crew had been stumped on it for a month. He looked at it for 40 minutes. Camille looked up from her desk. He works on older cars, mostly, Pearl said. People bring him things nobody else will touch. A pause. I know it's not what you've been doing. Camille looked at the tree line on the south side of the property. She had told herself Werner was the last one. She had meant it, and then the next morning she had woken at 5:15 and lain in the dark with the particular feeling of someone who has not quite finished, something they do not know how to finish. Fine, she said. Tell him to come take a look. Reed Callahan arrived on a Thursday morning in a 1998 F-250 with a long crack in the windshield and a faded Callahan's auto decal on the rear window. He was 41, broad through the shoulders from actual physical work, with dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of face that had spent enough time outdoors to earn some lines. He wore a gray Henley, work pants with a dried smear along the right knee, and carried a red metal toolbox so dented and stickered it looked like it had a history. His daughter was with him. Quinn was 9 with 2 braids that had been done carefully that morning and had since begun their own gradual independence. She was carrying a backpack and a sketchbook, and she looked around the garage with the frank, assessing attention of a child who found most places at least somewhat interesting. This is a nice garage, she said to no one in particular. Reed set his toolbox down and walked around the Charger once without touching it. Then he crouched beside the driver's door and looked at something Camille could not see from where she was standing. Then he stood and looked at the engine bay, which Pearl had already opened. What's the diagnostic history, he said, not looking at Camille, looking at the car. She told him, 11 teams, $7 million, 3 years, clean readings, consistent failure to start. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what kind of documentation did the previous teams leave? She had 11 thick binders in the study. Can I see them? Pearl brought the binders. Reed spent 45 minutes going through them at a folding table in the corner of the garage, while Quinn sat on a stool nearby, sketching in her book with the focused quiet of a child who had spent time in garages before and understood their rhythms. Then he went to work on the car. He worked differently from the 11 teams. They had come with rolling equipment carts, tablet-based diagnostic systems, laptops tethered to interface modules, and 2 of them had built custom rigs specifically for this car. Reed used a flashlight, a multimeter that appeared to be from sometime in the 90s, and his hands. He was slow. Not uncertain. She had watched uncertain people work on this car, and she knew the difference. Uncertain people moved fast and checked their own work twice and talked to each other across the engine bay. Reed was slow the way still water is slow. Absolute attention going into whatever he was touching, without any of it leaking out into performance. At one point, he lay flat on his back under the dashboard and did not move for 35 minutes. Are you all right? Camille asked at the 20-minute mark. Thinking, he said. Quinn, without looking up from her sketchbook, said, He does that. It's normal. The afternoon went on. Pearl brought sandwiches at noon, which Quinn ate with the methodical satisfaction of someone who had been running on a light breakfast and wasn't embarrassed about it. Reed ate a few bites while looking at a wiring diagram on his phone, then set it down and went back under the dashboard. At 4:30, he came out from under the car, sat on the floor with his back against the front tire, and looked at the ceiling for a while. "I think I know what they all missed," he said. Camille waited. "I need to come back tomorrow and confirm it. If I'm right, this is fixable. If I'm wrong, I'm back to square one, but I don't think I'm wrong." Quinn, from her stool, said, "He's usually not wrong when he says that." Reed looked at her. "What?" she said. "You're usually not." He gathered his tools. They left at 5, the truck pulling out slowly down the estate drive. Quinn, visible in the passenger seat, turned to say something to her father, her braids brushing her shoulders. Camille stood in the garage doorway and looked at the Charger. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the paint. Hemi-orange caught light in a way that almost seemed like an argument, like the car was making a case for itself. She went inside, ate dinner without tasting it, and thought about the expression on Reed's face when he had looked at the wiring diagram. Something had moved across it that she recognized but couldn't immediately place. Later in bed, she identified it: recognition. Not the performed confidence of a specialist presenting credentials. The private, involuntary recognition of someone who had seen something like this before. He was at the gate at 6 the next morning. Quinn was asleep in the passenger seat, her head against the window, her sketchbook open in her lap to a half-finished drawing of the Charger's grill. Reed drove to the garage without waking her, took his toolbox from the bed, and went in alone. In the pre-dawn light through the high garage windows, he looked for a few minutes, like someone who had set something down a long time ago and was deciding whether to pick it back up. Camille was in her office on a call with her CFO about quarterly projections when the sound came through the walls. The Charger's engine turned over once, then again. Then it caught, and the sound that followed was not a start and not a turnover. It was a roar, full and complete, the sound of something that had been still for 3 years, remembering what it was. It lasted 4 seconds before Reed eased off the throttle, and it settled into a low, rolling idle that she felt through the floor of her office in the soles of her feet. "I have to call you back," she said, and she was already standing. She walked, fast, the way you walk when you don't trust the thing to still be there if you take too long. Through the kitchen and out the east door and across the stone path to the garage, the idle growing louder and more real with every step. She came through the garage door and stopped. The engine was running. The sound at idle was lower and wider than she had expected, a deep rolling vibration that came up through the concrete floor. The garage smelled like exhaust and warm oil and something else, something she could not name but could locate, the way you locate a memory that lives below language, in the part that stores sensation without translation. The smell of her father's garage in Akron on a November afternoon when she was 12 and the overhead light was buzzing and Roy was bent over something in the engine bay, with his big hands doing something careful and exact. Reed stood to the left of the car, arms folded, watching the engine run. Satisfied but not triumphant, relief mostly, and under it something older and more complicated. Quinn had woken up. She was standing in the garage doorway in her socks, sketchbook under one arm, her braids compressed on one side from sleeping against the window. She looked at the running engine and then at her father. "You got it," she said. "It's running," Reed said, like the distinction mattered to him. Camille had not cried when they called her about Roy. She had not cried at the funeral, in Akron doing the estate paperwork, or in any of the 11 times a specialist team had loaded out empty-handed. She stood in her garage with the Charger idling, and she cried now. Not the controlled kind, the other kind. The kind that arrives without asking and doesn't care that Pearl was standing in the doorway, or that Quinn was watching with the still, careful attention of a child who has been near adult sorrow before and knows the right thing to do is simply let it exist. Reed did not tell her it was okay. He did not look away or shift his weight or perform the discomfort most people perform when they witness unexpected grief. He just stood there, and the Charger ran between them, and after a while the crying stopped the way crying does. Gradually, without resolution, because the thing that caused it hadn't changed, only the holding of it had. Pearl quietly brought Quinn inside. Camille sat on the garage floor with her back against the workbench, and her knees pulled up and let the sound of the engine settle around her. Reed sat on a step stool a few feet away, forearms on his knees, eyes on the running car. After a while, she said, "Tell me what you found." He stood and walked to the engine bay, pointed to a section of wiring along the left inner fender, a dense cluster of cables running through a bracket that didn't match the factory configuration. Whoever owned this car in the 90s installed an aftermarket fuel management override, he said. It was a common modification on collector cars of that era, essentially anti-theft, a hidden interrupt that could immobilize the ignition. The installer integrated it into the factory ignition circuit. Sophisticated work. The problem is the connection point. He traced a finger along the harness without touching it. Right here, there's a splice that got tucked behind the factory harness sleeve. Over 30 years, the connection degraded in a specific way. Not a clean break, not a short. A resistance drift. It only appeared at a particular engine temperature during the start sequence. At that temperature, the management module read the resistance as a sensor fault and cut the ignition cycle before the engine could complete its start. She looked at the splice point, a small, unremarkable thing tucked behind decades of wire. Every diagnostic tool those teams brought was looking for a failure, he said. A break, a short, a failed component. There wasn't one. There was a drift. A specific, temperature-dependent, location-specific drift in a modification that nobody knew existed because it had been hidden under the factory sleeve for 30 years. How did you find it? I wasn't looking for a failure. He leaned against the car, arms crossed. I looked at the whole system, the way everything connected. When you look at the whole instead of running tests on individual components, the behavior pattern becomes visible. The car always failed the same way. Same conditions, same result. That means the cause is in a fixed location doing a fixed thing. Once I understood what the behavior was telling me, finding the location was just time. $7 million, Camille said. 11 engineers. They were all working from the previous team's documentation, he said. By team 5 or 6, everyone was looking in the places already examined, trying to find what somebody else had missed. Nobody started from the beginning. He paused, and none of them knew about this type of modification. It wasn't in any service manual. It was third-party, aftermarket, buried. Something under that last sentence. A small weight. The tip of something larger. How do you know it? She said. He looked at the engine for a moment, then at her. I spent 12 years as an electrical integration engineer at Consolidated Motor Group, Detroit. We did consultation work with aftermarket suppliers in the late 80s and 90s. This type of ignition override was one of the systems we worked on during its development phase. I knew the integration points because I helped design the specifications for them. Camille was very still. You worked on this from the inside. He nodded, once. Why are you running a one-bay garage in Millhaven? He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, sorting out the honest answer from the easy one. My wife died when Quinn was born, he said. She had a heart condition nobody caught in time. Quinn came out healthy, and Dina was gone 4 hours later. He picked up a shop rag from the floor and turned it in his hands. I put in my notice 2 weeks later. I couldn't do what that job required and be present for a newborn at the same time. The hours, the travel. I needed to be somewhere I could be counted on every day. Millhaven was where Dina grew up. I wanted Quinn to have that place. He said it without apology and without the performance of sacrifice, the way he said everything, which was plainly, and without asking for anything in return. Camille looked at him for a long time. She had sat across from very talented people in her career and evaluated them with a precision she knew was partly cold. She was good at reading what people were concealing, what version of themselves they were constructing for the room. She did not think Reed Callahan was constructing anything. The story broke by Friday. One of the grounds crew had filmed the charger running on his phone and posted it before anyone thought to ask him not to. By noon, it was on the automotive news sites. By 3 in the afternoon, there was a camera crew at the estate gate. The headlines were clean and efficient, the way true things become when the internet reduces them. Billionaire's charger stumps 11 specialists. Small-town mechanic cracks it in 2 days. Camille read them with the experience of someone who had been inside a public narrative before and knew the shape they took. The story was a fairy tale. Rich woman, Dead father, impossible car, mystery mechanic. The internet was going to carry it for 10 days, and none of the actual texture of it would survive the translation. Not the 35 minutes Reed spent motionless under the dashboard. Not Quinn drawing in the corner. Not the particular way the engine sounded in those first few seconds when it finally ran. She managed the press with the controlled efficiency of 12 years of practice. One statement at the gate, 2 minutes. No details about Quinn, no address given. Reed asked that his last name not appear in the initial release. She honored it for as long as the search engines allowed, which turned out to be about 18 hours. She offered him a position 4 days later, sitting at the kitchen table with Pearl's coffee between them, speaking without preamble. I run a consulting division that takes on engineering problems other firms have stopped looking at, she said. Systems failures with no obvious cause. Integration faults that standard diagnostics can't locate. I need someone who looks at whole systems instead of individual components. Someone who sees what is actually there rather than what the protocol says to look for. Reed listened without interrupting. The terms would include a structured schedule with fixed hours. Nothing that touches Quinn's school day or her Fridays. In writing. With a penalty clause if the flexibility isn't honored in practice. He looked up. You'd put a penalty clause on yourself. On the contract, which is the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. His coffee had gone cold and he didn't seem to notice. I've been out of the industry for 9 years, he said. My certification's lapsed. The technology has moved. All of that is fixable. On your timeline, not a press cycles. He looked at the window, at the ridgeline going blue-gray above the lower slopes. I need to talk to Quinn, he said. Of course. Not to ask permission. He said it simply. She's 9. But she's been the person this whole arrangement was organized around for 9 years. If that changes, she needs to understand why. She processes things better when she understands the actual reason. That's good parenting. It's what works for her. He set down his cold coffee. She doesn't do well with surprises. She's been through enough of them. The kitchen held that sentence for a moment. Camille thought about a hospital in Detroit, a newborn, a man driving home to get things someone had asked for, and the call that must have come before he reached the exit. Quinn, when Reed explained the offer that evening over pasta she had helped make, asked 3 questions. First, would they still go to the shop on Fridays? Second, would she have to change schools? Third, the one she asked while twirling pasta around her fork and apparently not watching him closely, but watching him closely. Is this because you want to do it, or because you think you're supposed to? Reed told Camille about the third question 3 days later, on the phone, in the way he communicated things he thought were relevant, directly, without softening. What did you tell her? Camille asked. That it was both, he said. That you can want something and feel like you should do it at the same time, and that those aren't always different things. That wanting something you've been away from for a long time doesn't mean you gave it up wrong. It means you're ready now. A pause. She accepted that? She asked if she could get a new set of colored pencils. I took that as a yes. Before he gave his formal answer, Camille asked him to drive the Charger. Not around the property, actually drive it. The mountain road above the estate that ran north along the ridge, with the valley spread out below and the far ranges stacking up blue to the horizon. She rode in the passenger seat. He drove carefully at first, learning the car, feeling how it responded, and then less carefully, not reckless but fully present, giving it what it wanted, which was to be driven with full attention and some trust. Neither of them talked for the first several miles. The sound of the engine filled the cab completely, a sound so total it pushed everything else to the edge of consciousness. She watched the road and thought about Roy at 63, signing the papers, calling her that night with the boy in his voice. She thought about a canvas cover, lifted at the edge every Sunday morning, a palm on the quarter panel, a man who had been afraid to use the thing he loved because he loved it too much to risk losing it. I think my father thought if he drove it enough, something would go wrong, she said. Reed glanced at her, or he was afraid of what it meant, he said. Actually driving it instead of just owning it. She looked out at the ridge. Yeah, she said. Maybe that. The road straightened ahead, and Reed opened the throttle and the Charger's 440 answered with everything it had. The sound swelling and filling the cab, the speedometer climbing, the mountains enormous and indifferent on three sides. She felt it in her sternum, in the back of her throat, in some place she did not have a name for. She thought, "I hear you, Dad. I hear it." They turned around where the road ended and drove back slowly. Neither of them felt the need to say anything about what had just happened, because it had happened, and they had both been inside it, and that was enough. Reed called 5 days later. He accepted the offer. His conditions, the schedule, the Fridays, Quinn's schools, the recertification on his own timeline, he stated them without apology, and she agreed to each one without negotiating. He said he wasn't going to perform a comeback. He would do the work or he would not take it. She said that was exactly what she needed, and she meant it. Quinn asked if she could visit on Fridays when her father came to consult at the estate. Camille said yes without hesitation. Quinn began arriving on Friday afternoons with her sketchbook and opinions about lunch. And Pearl, who had opinions of her own, found this more enjoyable than she had anticipated. The depth assessment program launched the following spring. Camille had been thinking about it since October, since the drive in the mountains, since sitting on the garage floor with the Charger, running and understanding something she had not allowed herself to understand before. The way you look at a person, the category you assign them, at the moment you first encounter them, becomes what you see, and more importantly, what you stop seeing. She had driven past the answer for 8 miles in 2 years without once asking the question that would have led her to it. The program reviewed the full professional and educational backgrounds of employees across all support functions, maintenance, logistics, facilities, administrative, without regard to current title. First cohort, 41 people. Among them, a building maintenance supervisor who had spent 8 years as a licensed structural engineer before a family medical crisis. Erased his savings and his license lapsed. A parking coordinator who had practiced dentistry in the Philippines for 11 years and held credentials that American regulation did not recognize without additional testing she had never been able to afford. A data entry clerk who had been developing a materials simulation model in her personal time for 6 researchers, shown her work without attribution, called genuinely innovative. None of them were exceptions. Camille said this in every internal announcement, every board presentation, every interview she eventually gave. These are not unusual cases. These are people who were carrying something their job title made invisible. The question is not why they ended up here. The question is why it took us this long to look. The Charger stayed at the estate, but it did not sit anymore. Camille drove it on Saturdays, and sometimes on weekday evenings when the day had been long, and the Blue Ridge was doing the thing it did in the last hour of light, turning everything to silhouette and gold. She drove it the way Roy never quite let himself drive it. Windows down, engine open, no particular destination, which was the only destination it had ever needed. Quinn rode along sometimes, in the passenger seat with her sketchbook balanced on her knees, drawing whatever the mountain roads threw at her. A fence line, a hawk, the way the road curved up into the canopy and disappeared. She had started asking Reed to teach her how the engine worked, not just what it did, but how, the actual physics, the actual systems. He was teaching her the way he taught everything, completely, patiently, with no assumption that a 9-year-old couldn't follow the real answer. On a Saturday afternoon in late October, Camille looked at the Charger in the garage and thought about Roy in Akron, lifting the canvas cover every Sunday morning to confirm it was still there, real, his. She thought about the handwritten ledger. 40 years of careful entries. She thought about what it costs to want something that long and then be afraid of it once you have it. Afraid of the miles you might put on it. Afraid of the scratch that might find it. Afraid of loving something so much that using it feels like spending it down. She thought about Reed in the truck on that first morning, those minutes before he got out. The most important things in a life rarely arrived as decisions. They arrived as small movements in one direction, when you could have gone the other way. Reed's truck coming up the estate drive on a Thursday morning because Pearl had mentioned a name. A 9-year-old in socks standing in a garage doorway. A man lying under a dashboard for 35 minutes, thinking. The car was never really about the car. It was about a machinist from Akron who saved 37 years for something he was too careful to use, and a daughter who needed to hear that engine run not because of what the car was worth, but because of what it held. It was about a man who had walked away from the version of himself that required too much, and then one September morning walked back toward it. Slowly, the way you approach something that matters when you have finally stopped being afraid of what it will cost you to want it again. And it was about the particular blindness that comes from looking only at what someone is doing rather than what they know. The way talent goes quiet when circumstance requires it. The way quiet gets mistaken for absence. The way absence becomes the category that sticks. Until someone asks the question. Until someone actually looks. That was always the first step, and it was always the one that nobody thought to take.